Hello, I'm William Gallagher, and this is a special edition of MacNN's One More Thing. It's WWDC, Apple's Worldwide Developer Conference, as you've heard of, and maybe as you've even seen before, because this is Apple's best moments in Apple's own words, plus, yeah, a few of mine. Now, ideally, you and I would start right back at the beginning, but we can't. Amazingly, there is even disagreement about when the first true WWDC was, as opposed to the various other Apple developer conferences. Now, I found this a lot while researching and writing MacNN's This Week in Apple History series. There are these big, important moments that are remembered and that had impact and that lasted, but when they specifically took place, just not so much. With WWDC, for example, most sources claim that at least a version of it began in 1983. That looks likely. Some claim, though, that that was when we also heard this.
IBM wants it all and is aiming its guns on its last obstacle to industry control, Apple. Will Big Blue dominate the entire computer industry, the entire information age? Was George Orwell right about 1984?
That was Steve Jobs getting the crowd ready while he unveiled Macintosh. Now, that was actually a shareholders event, not WWDC. And that's the thing. Everything we now think of as a WWDC staple, the keynotes, the launches, originally didn't happen at WWDCs. They would happen at the shareholder events. They would happen at other things. They would happen a lot at Macworld, the now defunct trade show. That's the reason I can't be too fussed, I think, about being unable to pin down specifics to the earliest days of WWDC. The reason is it was originally a conference for developers. Now, it still is, obviously. It's a week-long event where developers get to work with Apple software engineers on the nitty-gritty of the latest iOS and OS X developments. But now, today, well, really, that's Tuesday to Friday, or okay, maybe Monday afternoon to Friday afternoon. Monday morning, usually 10 a.m. local time, that's now WWDC's true worldwide part. It's the keynote which is presented in front of these developers, and it's presented in front of a lot of journalists, but it's aimed at everyone watching online. It's now where Apple says everything is great, yet today we're going to see some new products or updates that make everything greater. Or it usually is.
I wanted to come and just have a chat this morning. I know you've been getting lots of presentations all week, so I didn't want to do a big fancy presentation.
There is one where Steve Jobs is not announcing new products, and he is not saying anything is great, and he is talking to developers, not the rest of us. And just to round this off, although he did it at WWDC in 1997, he did it on the Friday at the very end of the conference.
I don't know, I spent a lot of time working on it. And
Yeah. Well, you know, let me say something that's sort of generic. I know some of you spent a lot of time working on stuff that we put a bullet in the head of. I apologize. I feel your pain. But Apple suffered for several years from lousy engineering management. I have to say it. And there were people that were going off in 18 different directions, doing arguably interesting things in each one of them. Good engineers, lousy management. And what happened was, you look at the farm that's been created with all these different animals going in different directions, and it doesn't add up. The total is less than the sum of the parts. And so we had to decide what are the fundamental directions we're going in, and what makes sense and what doesn't. And there were a bunch of things that didn't. And microcosmically, they might have made sense. Macrocosmically, they made no sense. And, you know, the hardest thing is, when you think about focusing, right? You think, well, focusing is saying yes. No. Focusing is about saying no. Focusing is about saying no. And you've got to say no, 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 no. And when you say no, you piss off people. And they go talk to the San Jose Mercury, and they write a shitty article about you. You know? And it's really a pisser. Because you want to be nice. You don't want to tell the San Jose Mercury to person that's telling you this, just was asked to leave or this or that or this or that. So you take the lumps. And Apple's been taking their share of lumps for the last 6 months in a very unfair way. And it's been taking them, like an adult. And I'm proud of that. And there's more to come, I'm sure. There's more to come. I mean, I read these articles about some of these people that have left. I know some of these people. They haven't done anything in 7 years. And, they leave and it's like, it's like the company's going to fall apart the next day.
Steve Jobs at WWDC in 1997. I should tell you, I'll put links to the full videos in the show notes for this episode of One More Thing. See MacNN.com for a lot of hours of video. But 1997, that bit you just heard is from an hour-ish or so, slightly more, and it's become known as Steve's fireside chat with developers. But that is such a cozy word for what really was anything but. He was telling a comparatively hostile crowd, compared to fans who turn up to the shows now, a hostile crowd of developers, that their efforts, their sometimes years, always at least months of so far unpaid work, developing software to Apple standards, to Apple's instructions, to Apple's reveals of what its future will be, were wasted. So much time and work, all now worthless. And yet, Jobs pulled it off. At the time, it's possible that the pain even helped, because at least at last, here was someone at Apple who knew what he was doing. In 1997, the developers saw a confident, certain, and as it turns out, remarkably far-sighted Steve Jobs telling them the future, telling them the reasons for the future, and most importantly of all, drawing a line under the past. It hurt, but it helped. Whereas next year, now 1998 was the next year, and I'm not going to go through every single year, I'm only going to go through the important ones, but 98 was important because it was a hybrid kind of a year. Steve Jobs was doing his keynote performance exactly how we'd now recognise it, but he was still aiming at developers, and he wasn't introducing new products for the rest of us, so to speak. It was so close, though, so close. This 1998 WWDC came less than a week after the launch of the iMac. When he got to WWDC, though, this is what Steve Jobs presented instead.
And now, Mac OS. Most important piece of software we've got. Now, 10 months ago, when I got to Apple, a lot of people thought that this was the future of the Mac OS. Apple had been saying this for a few years. It was crazy, because the Mac OS has 22 million customers. About double that number of users. It is one of only 2 high-volume operating systems on the planet, and it has 12,000 applications with developers who make their livelihood from it. Far from being something that we should discard, it was very rapidly apparent that this is our crown jewel.
It's a little hard to believe now that Steve Jobs was talking about OS X in 1998. But he was far-sighted. If you watch the whole video, you'll see he lays out when OS 8.5 and things were going to come out, and there were various names for those. Those dates slightly changed. The names were altered a little bit. But otherwise, what he laid out in 1998 is what happened. We and the developers moved to OS X, and it was an important move. In 1998 and 1999, Jobs worked to persuade developers to come on that journey. If we skip ahead to 2002, he was confident enough then that it was working that he spent part of that year's WWDC on this.
Mac OS 9 was a friend to us all. He worked tirelessly on our behalf, always posting our applications, never refusing a command, always at our beck and call.
Well, sometimes.
Except occasionally when he forgot who he was and needed to be restarted. Mac OS 9 came into this world in October of 1998.
Sorry for the sound quality. You're going to find it's a bit ropey what's available and what isn't, but you get the idea. It was a funeral for OS 9. What do you think of that, though? Some people found it hilarious. If you watch the whole thing, you hear a lot of people in the crowd there found it just uproarious. I find it a bit embarrassing. I felt the same in 2010 when Microsoft held a funeral for the iPhone as part of its launch of Windows Phone 7. And that was a joke too, just not necessarily the one Microsoft thought it was. Let me move back from that Microsoft 2010 thing and on from Apple's 2002 one, because now I think let's call it 2005.
And so what we're doing is we're going to make this even easier.
WWDC for 2003 and 2004 had introduced new versions of OS X and products including the 30-inch Apple Cinema display. But in 2005, it was bigger than that. It was huge.
Because you're not going to have to go download other applications and get all sorts of stuff together to make this happen. We're going to build it right in to iTunes and iPod. So you can subscribe to any podcast, and we're going to make it really easy. And so right into iTunes, very simple. But one of the most important things is, how do you find these podcasts? You want people typing URLs into iTunes? Well, they could do that, but we're also going to build right into the iTunes Music Store an iPod or a podcast directory, so that we're going to list thousands of podcasts, and you'll be able to click on them, download them for free, and subscribe to them right in iTunes.
There were already thousands of podcasts, and those had been ignited by the iPod. But here, 2005, iTunes became the tool for downloading existing podcasts and for uploading new ones too. Podcasting really began on that stage in 2005. At least it did for me. Within a few weeks, I had my own UK DVD review, which ran weekly and which I still get emailed about. At one point, my UK DVD review was in the top 10 of all podcasts in all categories across the world. I think at the time there were only 9 podcasts, but it's grown, hasn't it? And yet, for all the size of podcasting today, for all that it meant to me, for all that it's how I'm getting to talk with you today, I'm still half kidding about this being why WWDC 2005 was huge. Really, it was. Well, we learned to see how podcasting grew. At that time, in the presentation, we knew immediately how important 2005's other announcement was.
Today, it's time to begin a third transition. We want to constantly be making the best computers for you and the rest of our users. And so it's time for a third transition, and yes, it's true. We are going to begin the transition from the PowerPC to Intel processors, and we are going to begin it for you now and for our customers next year. Now, why are we going to do this? Right? Didn't we just get through going from OS 9 to OS 10? Isn't the business great right now? Why do we want another transition? Because we want to be making the best computers for our customer looking forward. The most important reasons are that as we look ahead, though we have great products right now, and we've got some great PowerPC products still yet to come, as we look ahead, we can envision some amazing products we want to build for you. And we don't know how to build them with the future PowerPC roadmap. And that's why we're going to do this.
That was 2005's move from PowerPC to Intel. You can argue that it should have happened sooner. You can argue that PowerPC was pretty good for a time. Some of my favorite Macs over the years used exactly that. But you can't argue that Apple didn't pull off this move very well. It was a big move for developers. It was as big for them as the switch to OS X. And it was just as big for us too. Over that move to Intel and that move to OS X, we had sea changes in the Apple landscape. Sea changes in the landscape, but I think you know what I mean. We ultimately had to buy new software if we wanted to carry on working and use the new features. Then we eventually had to buy new machines to run it on. And yet, by 2007, we'd done it.
An iPod, a phone, and an internet communicator. An iPod, a phone. Are you getting it? These are not 3 separate devices. This is one device. And we are calling it
No, yeah, sorry, got to stop that. It is 2007. It is Steve Jobs. It's a full-on Steve Jobs keynote presentation, and maybe the best he ever did. But it wasn't at WWDC. It was his own event, its own event. And after some years of getting new products unveiled at WWDC, around this point, it seemed to become the thing to announce new categories of products in their own event. Later on, the Apple Watch, here the iPhone. WWDC in 2007, well, it got iPhone web apps. Yeah, nobody remembers them, because nobody was interested in them either. Oh, it also got Safari for Windows, but yeah. Oh, there was one more thing about WWDC 2007.
Hello, everyone. I'm Steve Jobs. Yes, that's right, it's me, Chief Executive of Apple Inc., 1 Infinite Loop, Cupertino, California, 95014. I know the address. That's how you know it's me, Steve Jobs. Well, I've got some big news this year, and I want the whole world to hear it. I quit. Yes, that's right. I'm resigning effective immediately. And what's more, I'm shutting down all of Apple. Now, I know this comes as a surprise to some of you, but if you think about it, you'll see I really didn't have a choice. I mean, Vista's been performing so well. They've sold dozens of copies. It was so clear to me that Leopard was just going to get lost in all of that wow.
The next year, 2008, now we see the iPhone coming to WWDC.
As we arrive at iPhone's first birthday, we're gonna take it to the next level. And today we're introducing the iPhone 3G.
We never did see an iPhone 2. But alongside the iPhone, WWDC 2008 also brought us something else, something that should have been a lot more successful than it was.
It's like having Exchange for the rest of us. Not all of us work in large enterprises. Not all of us have Exchange servers, but boy, would we like to have those capabilities. Well, now you can. With Mobile Me, we can all get push email, contacts, and calendars right to our devices.
Phil Schiller introducing Mobile Me. Back in the day, there had been iTools, then there was .Mac, now there was Mobile Me, and fortunately afterwards there was iCloud. Now, Apple's iCloud isn't perfect, except it really is when you compare it to Mobile Me. Speaking of iCloud, take a guess where it was announced. This is hard to believe now, but since it's hard to believe because 2008's Mobile Me was such a flop, but iCloud, its replacement, its successor, it was announced at the 2011 WWDC, 3 years later. We don't tend to remember that gap. We just now tend to use iCloud without thinking about it. And unfortunately, if we think of 2011's WWDC, it's not because of iCloud. It's because of this guy.
Thank you very much. It always... Thank you. It always helps, and I appreciate it very much. So, we've got an awesome morning together this morning. And thank you for coming so much. We have over 5,200 attendees here today. We sold out within 2 hours. I'm sorry, this is the biggest place we can get to have this, so I'm sorry for all those people who couldn't make it. And we wish we could sell more tickets, but we don't know where to have it if we do.
Steve Jobs' last WWDC keynote, 2011. That was June the 6th, 2011, and Steve Jobs died 121 days later on October the 5th. One thing about that, the day before he died, Apple held an event, and again it was the type of launch we associate with WWDC's opening keynotes. It was the one where Siri was unveiled. Steve Jobs didn't appear, and on the day, you could just sense that Apple wasn't its usual hyped-up, ebullient self. Let's move on to 2012. Siri comes to the iPad at WWDC 2012. Is it not weird to think there was a time when it wasn't, when Siri was only on iPhone? Then 2012, well, it also unloaded just a smorgasbord of products, both hardware and software.
Next is Maps. In iOS 6, we have built an entire new mapping solution from the ground up, and it is beautiful. This is what Lake Tahoe looks like. We're doing all the cartography ourselves. Here's New York City. I'm going to go through every city. The beautiful, beautiful maps. Now, part of maps is local search. You have to be able to find businesses and points of interest. And so we've already ingested more than 100 million business listings around the world to make a great local search. Once you find a business, bring up the info card, and it's beautiful. We've integrated with Yelp, so you get reviews and ratings and lots of photos right in the card. We're also building a traffic service. We have this great traffic view, so it's easy to see where the incidents are or where the slow traffic is. And on top of that, we overlay the incidents. So it's easier for you to figure out whether traffic's likely to speed up in a given location anytime soon. In addition to other data sources, we're using anonymous, real-time crowdsourced data right from our iOS users to keep this traffic fresh and up to date. We're also building in turn-by-turn navigation.
In 2012, Apple ditched Google Maps for its own service, Apple Maps. No doubt it was a big mistake for how inaccurate Apple Maps were and how angry users became. No doubt, though, it was also essential. There's a lot of to and forth between Apple and Google over who pays who, what for which service things, but broadly, the fighting ground for this was that Google had been keeping its best Maps features, most specifically turn-by-turn driving directions, away from iOS and exclusively for Android. When you look back at it now, who made the big mistake? 2013 and 15 years on since Steve Jobs laid out the roadmap, 15 years since he laid out the roadmap for OS X, the WWDC of 2013 made a big change. This is when, well, listen to Craig Federighi explain it.
Our latest release, Mountain Lion, is the 9th of our big cat named releases in just over a decade. As we turn our attention now toward the 10th, we've hit a real issue. We do not want to be the first software in history to be delayed due to a dwindling supply of cats. Now, fortunately, we do have a creative group at Apple, and we can think out of the box. And so we thought maybe we could take this lion thing in a different direction. So I'm proud to present to you today OS X Sea Lion. What do you think? Okay, maybe not. That could be a bit of a dead end. So, in fact, we're really excited about the future of the Mac, and we want a set of names that are going to carry us for at least the next 10 years. And you know, the answer was really obvious to us. It's those places that inspire us here in California, in the place where OS X is designed and built. So for our first California-themed release, we went just outside our backyard, just off the coast, to a place with some of the biggest waves and most extreme surfing in all of North America, OS X Mavericks.
That was Craig Federighi announcing the new OS X Mavericks and place names to follow-ish, the format anyway. In the next year, 2014, Craig Federighi got his own song.
Forget everything you used to know. This here's the Craig Federighi Show.
The Craig Federighi Show is a summary of the entire 2014 WWDC keynote in 3 minutes and 25 seconds by musician Jonathan Mann.
Translucent windows and a change of font. Dark mode, now that's what I want. Continuity across all your devices. Keep all my photos at semi-reasonable prices. Swipe that email down, down. Swipe that email down. Family sharing cloud drive. Swipe that email down, everybody.
Is that the best thing to have come out of WWDC 2014? There was Swift as well, though, the brand new programming language that's now used for developing apps. Developing. Grief. We forget that's what WWDC is supposed to be about. In 2015, well, WWDC always was for developers, and most of the week it always is. But in 2015, that's when we got maybe the most direct thing for us. We got the WWDC keynote that was devoted to the rest of us.
Before we close this morning, we do have one more thing. I'd like to tell you about something that we've been working really hard on and something we are super excited about. You know, we love music. And music is such an important part of our lives and our culture. We've had a long relationship with music at Apple, and music has had a very rich history of change, some of which we played a part in. Today we're announcing Apple Music, the next chapter in music, and I know you are going to love it. It will change the way that you experience music forever.
It was the launch of Apple Music, arguably a great success, and Apple's News, yeah, not so much. Then there was iOS 9, there was watchOS 2, which ushered in a new era for apps on the Apple Watch, though not so as you'd notice so far, and OS 10 El Capitan. I worked with a guy once, a technology journalist, who complained, actually, that some particular WWDC event went on for ages, just as he'd expected anyway, and that he could have got all the news at the end. Why didn't he then? Apple did exactly that day what we now know it always does. Whichever WWDC it was, Apple did everything this guy predicted. Why didn't he just take the morning off and read MacNN's coverage at the end? Because there is something compelling about WWDC and all of Apple's keynotes now. I was really struck while I was researching This Week in Apple History by a guy called Mikola. This fella, he wrote some of Apple's keynote speeches, and more recently he's done a video about the 1997 one when things went just fascinatingly wrong. But in that video, and I've got a link for it in the show notes for you, he also defined all the keynotes today, WWDC and other events, the lot of them, in one go.
It's ritualized. Tim Cook, and before him Steve Jobs, comes on stage, gives a nice cheery update on business success, how much of this we sold, how much of that we sold, market share, domination, growth, pie charts, cherry-picked statistics, how many apps, how many songs. iPad is crushing it, iPhone is crushing it. Little snark about competitors. We get an update on the Apple Stores, the most profitable retail operation on the blah, blah, blah. Then comes a product introduction, or 3 or 5. Usually it's an incremental upgrade to an existing line. Occasionally, it's a revolutionary new category. And that always starts by describing some itch that nobody has ever thought to scratch before. We marvel that nobody's ever been smart enough to even notice this itch, much less create the perfect way to scratch it. And we hear about software, hardware, OS updates, demos, always demos. A few developers trot out to show us some whiz-bang games, and in the modern era, maybe a carrier. And then comes the ritual Johnny Ive video featuring Bob Mansfield, Michael Chow, maybe Phil Schiller. It's about technology, design, materials, and manufacturing. Johnny waxes ecstatic about how pleasing it will be to hold and fondle and display and maybe even use. It's thin, it's light, so light. And then sometimes there's a kicker in Steve's famous phrase, one more thing. Usually there's a hip musician to round out the show, but basically that's it. It's liturgy. It's like Mass.
Now, as a lapsed Catholic myself, I'm uncomfortable at the idea of WWDC being a mass, but he makes a really good point, and I will be in attendance, or at least watching online, for this year's service. Will you? You can get coverage of it. You can get coverage of WWDC and all Apple keynote events on MacNN, where, please do remember, you'll also be able to see every one of the videos that I've included clips from here. It's a lot of watching, and some of it in dodgy quality, but all of it really interesting. Watch the Fireside Chat from 1997. That's the one that I think is the most riveting. Thanks for listening. Good talking to you. I'm William Gallagher, and this was MacNN's One More Thing.